Hello and welcome to Let's Talk Love. Today I am talking to Dr. Lauren Fogel Mersy. Dr. Lauren is a licensed psychologist and certified sex therapist. We dive into her new book that she co-authored with Dr. Jennifer Wenzel called Desire, an inclusive guide to navigating libido differences in relationships. Dr. Lauren talks about one of the main reasons people come to her for sex therapy, because they have differences in libido. She explains how much of the time it's not just about one person who has high libido versus the other that has low libido. Rather, it's learning the difference between how each person's desire is cultivated. It could be that one person has predominant style of spontaneous desire, whereas the other is responsive desire. Her book is so educational and informative, and full of ways that we can improve our sex lives. I hope our conversation gives you new insights and ideas for adding more pleasure into your own life. Because really, who doesn't want more of that? Enjoy. Welcome to Let's Talk Love, the podcast that brings you real talk, fresh ideas, and expert insights every week. Our guests are the most trusted voices in love and relationships, and they're here for you with tools, information, and friendly advice to help you expand the ways you love, relate, and communicate. We tackle the big questions, not shying away from the complex, the messy, the awkward, and the joyful parts of relationships. I'm your host, Robin Ducharme. Now, let's talk love. Hello and welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Love. I'm so happy to be joined by Dr. Lauren Fogel Mersy. Lauren, thank you for being with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me here.
I'll introduce you. I know you are a licensed psychologist, and you are a sex therapist and the author of this new book, which I'm going to hold up for those of you that are watching this. It's called Desire, an inclusive guide to navigating libido differences in relationships. And you co-wrote this book with Dr. Jennifer Wenzel. Did I pronounce her name correctly?
Wenzel, yeah.
Wenzel. It's fantastic, Lauren. I'm just so happy to have you. And we're going to talk all about sex, which is yay.
Oh, thank you so much. One of my favorite subjects to talk about.
Oh, mine too. You know, we talk about relationships every week on the podcast, and every once in a while we'll talk about sex. And like, who doesn't love to talk about sex? I mean, well, I think a lot of people. Yes. No, that's hilarious, Lauren. You know, it's funny. I said that out loud and then I thought in the back of my head, actually, a lot of people don't like to talk about it. But I think we do with our friends, but maybe not like with our partners.
Right? Yeah, exactly. They like this. Like they'll listen to podcasts, but it's so different to talk to your own sexual partner about things that you want or don't like, or that's a whole other can of worms.
Yes. And so that's why I think this is why we do what we do. Because right. I mean, I'm a 45-year-old woman, and I think now I can honestly say how important sex is to me. If you were talking to my 30-year-old self, or I don't think I would have been in that place, but I want to talk about it. I want to learn about it. I want to know more. I want to understand myself more so that I can have more pleasurable sex. So that's why we're talking about this today.
I love that. And I also love how it highlights for you, Robin, as it does tend to be true for so many people, that there's seasons of life where maybe this is more significant or more of a priority, other times where it's not as high on the priority list. And that's absolutely common among sort of an entire lifespan and among the life of a relationship.
Yeah. So tell us how you became, what led you to become a sex therapist? And then we'll talk about why you and Jennifer decided to write this book, which I loved your book. So we'll dive into that too.
Thank you so much. You know, it's such a common question that I get asked, and I always am, trying to work on some sort of interesting story to put to it. But, the answer is that I knew when I was in the ninth grade that I wanted to be a therapist, and
Wow, that's
actually
early.
specifically a psychologist. Yeah, I think my teacher, Mr. Botnick, in ninth grade, we took a
Yeah.
class that had you take basically a personality test. I think with some like different colors. I think it was a color test, and
Yeah.
it came out with all of these different professions, and it was part of a life skills class. And one of the
Love that.
things that came up was psychologist, and at 14 I didn't know what that was. So it came with this computer program back on like really old ancient Macs at the time,
Yeah.
and you look it up, and it told me what a psychologist was, and I was like, that's it, that's what I'm going to be. And
Wow.
then over the next few years, as a young teen, sort of noticing how many questions I had about sex, how nobody was talking about sex, how there was so little education and information about it, I was just really curious. And then I realized at some point that I could put these two things together, that I could be a therapist, a psychologist, and I could specialize in sexuality.
Yes.
And so I don't know, it just sort of took off at a young age.
I think that's just so awesome. And so you are Canadian. Yay,
I
Canadian!
am
Love
Canadian, and talking
that.
to you will bring out my accent really
Yeah, oh, that's
strongly.
awesome. Yeah, it's funny. I don't even think I've got an accent, but okay, that's great.
I
We
didn't
might say
until I
a
moved
few more
to the
times.
US.
Yeah,
Yep, yep,
yeah. Okay, and then so now you're in Minnesota,
yep,
right?
yep.
So tell us about what motivated you and Jennifer Vinsel to write this book, Desire.
Yeah, yeah. We were friends. We came from the same postdoctoral training program here at the University of Minnesota. We went out to dinner one night, and I said to Jen, you know, desire concerns, desire discrepancies, low libido. These are the concerns that people come in to see us with,
Yeah.
every day of the week. And what we noticed is that most of the books that are written about this are aimed at cisgender women.
Hmm.
And that's perfectly fine. That's a demographic that deserves to have, books written for them and information out there. But we kept finding that there wasn't a good book to refer our clients to that was inclusive of sort of all genders. So including, cis men, including trans non-binary folks. And so originally we set out to write a book about low libido that
Hmm.
was inclusive of all genders. And so it was going to be a low libido book, and that's how it started. It didn't end up being a low libido book. It ended up
No.
sort of shifting along the writing process. When we originally pitched the book to sell to a publisher, it was a low libido book that was inclusive. And we started to realize that, when we talk to folks about low libido, it's almost like I'm hard pressed to even think of a situation where somebody's come to see me who wasn't in a partnership coming in with that concern.
Yeah.
And so we started to really think on it. And it's like, it's more the discrepancy around desire in the relationship that people are coming in with, rather than just an individual saying my libido is low and I'm distressed about it.
So that is what exactly. So people are coming into the office with this concern, and you're uncovering the collective, which is it's not so much an individual. Oftentimes, it's the relational.
Yeah,
There's a relational, big relational component.
yeah, yeah. It's a dynamic between
Yes.
two people, because or two or more people, because you could be the quote unquote lower libido partner with this partnership. And then let's say there's a breakup, you start a new relationship, that could completely change in the
Shift.
next
Yes.
partnership. So that's not an
Yes.
individual thing then. That's a between people thing.
Yes. And so I love that. The other, I learned so much from reading your book because there is so much sex education. You are talking about gender and gender identity and how and the fluidity, that we're in now in our collective. understanding that, using the right terms. So there's a lot of education. Thank you for that. And then there's, understanding our bodies, understanding ourselves. There was just, it's such, like I said, when we first started talking, I was like, this is going to be my new sex Bible, because I read it and I got so much out of it, but I know I'm going to be turning back to it over and over again for this, reference points and exercises. There's a lot of prompts. There's questions to ask. I was journaling. So you're encouraging people, obviously, as you're reading the book, to reflect on yourself and your partner, asking yourself these questions. And there's just so much to know. And that's okay. As we get older, we change, our sexual desire changes, our health changes, our bodies change. And so it's just this progression. I think that's just awesome.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to hear that it's a Bible kind of book for someone. That was our hope in writing this, is it becomes sort of a go-to on the topic, for, both the topic of desire and also desire differences in partnerships. Because that specifically is, not as often written about, the between partners kind of aspect. But yeah, I think there's so much that we talk about one-on-one or two-on-one in our sessions. And we keep being reminded, after 10 years of talking about sort of the same concepts, you start to think that everybody knows the things that you're talking about. And we're reminded constantly, this stuff is not out there. It's not as, certainly it's common for us because we talk about it all the time. But over and over, there's so much sort of foundational information about like how your body works, that there's more than one type of desire, that desire differences are to be expected. And I think sometimes we forget, for brief moments, because we're reminded constantly that is new information for so many people, because where would you have learned that?
Right. So you often, like in your office, one of the biggest things you're hearing people say is, I have lost interest in sex, right?
Yeah.
And you say, despite popular narratives to the contrary, this is not just an individual problem, but a relational difference. So you're helping people navigate their desire differences. And the one thing that I was like, so it's just so many learnings, Lauren. We're going to go through quite a few, but everybody just has to read the book, because there's no way we're going to get through a lesson in one episode. But so you say sex is not a drive. Yeah. So let's talk about that, because that's just something that people like, your sex drive. Well, let's be more accurate about this. Like even just the terminology we have to get clear on, right?
Yeah. 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 And when we talk about that in, a social media space, there's a lot of people who will push back. Yes, it is. Of course it is, because I feel driven, because I feel this is the natural, it's human. And then, the argument that, as a species, to survive, we need to procreate. Well, that just speaks to the times where you're having procreative sex.
Right.
What about all the other times?
Yes, which is the majority.
Right. So then maybe you have sex, a couple of times, a few times until and then what happens after that? So a drive, in the way that we understand drive theory, a drive is something that you do to keep you as an individual system alive. That if you don't tend to it after a certain amount of time, you won't survive. So there are things like food and water and sleep. Those are the big ones. You can only go so long without those things, because before you as an individual system will no longer be here.
Yeah.
Sex doesn't operate that way.
Yeah. Some people may argue that, but they'll
argue it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's where I very seldom do this, but I'll pull an expert card every once in a while. This is what we know about drive theory. And there's another word for what you're describing. And it doesn't mean that people don't feel this strong desire or a strong motivation. There's another framework to understand that. It's called an incentive motivation system. And what that means is you have to have a good reason to seek it out. There has to be something
Yes.
intrinsically interesting about that for you as an individual in order to be motivated and interested.
Right. So you share a lot of great stories with your clients in the book. And this is about the motivation. And this is why it's understanding your motivators for wanting sex,
Right.
and understanding your partners. And those also are so fluid and large, like spanning. Like
Yeah.
my motivator right now could be different today than tomorrow or the next
Right.
day, right?
Yes.
But the key to wanting to come back to it over and over again is satisfaction.
Yeah.
Right?
The problem that I see happen a lot for partners is if one partner, let's say in a couple, because most of the folks I see are in couples, not always, but let's say in a dyad of two, if one partner has a really high motivation for sex, is often interested, has more spontaneous desire, the other one doesn't feel some of those things, maybe has a different sort of interest. What happens for the, quote unquote, lower libido partner, and I put that in quotes because it depends on what we're measuring that, based off of. But for the lower libido partner, what tends to happen in some partnerships is they'll start having sex for the other person's
Right.
pleasure and benefit. And in and of itself, it's not a bad thing. There's nothing wrong with that. But if over time, that's really your only motivator, is just to satisfy your partner, and there's nothing really that you're getting out of it that's satisfying, it's not going to sustain you over a long term.
Well, you're just going to be, I've heard this before, right? I've had friends say that to me. It's like the only, it's all for him, and just get it over with. And then well, wow. Okay. If that is your sex life, that's pretty sad, but it's also like, how is, like you said, it's just, you're not satisfying yourself. You're doing it for another person.
No. And again, sometimes that's a perfect.
Sometimes,
motivator.
Oh yes. Sometimes,
great.
Yes.
My partner wants to be close in this way, and I'm up for it. Great.
Right.
But if it's consistently that way over time, it starts to become too one-sided.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the different types of desire, because this was a great learning. So the difference between spontaneous, right? And which is what we're seeing. Tell us about spontaneous desire. And obviously this is what we grew up on. We're still seeing it in the movies. And like you pointed out, it's like, these are new relationships often, right? It's like the hot and heavy, and how do you, you see each other and you just want to have sex, right?
Yeah. Yeah, spontaneous desire for many of us is the only desire we've ever seen depicted in the media. And it's the only type of desire that we know. And that's, I think, because I think the media plays a huge role in that, right? Like with movies and shows, it's showing you a snapshot of the getting to know you phase, the honeymoon phase, when things are, hot and heavy and exciting. And spontaneous desire for sex is higher at that point. And so spontaneous desire is basically this sense of, desire that just sort of emerges either rather quickly or sort of out of the blue, where it's not something that you feel like you have to work at or conjure, but it sort of emerges. And Emily Nagoski has a great definition for this. It's desire that emerges in anticipation of pleasure. So it's the desire first, and then going to seek out something sexual, getting aroused, going from there. So that's a bit about spontaneous desire, but it's a totally valid way to have desire.
Right. But you say a lot of people, and I don't know, what would you say about this, Lauren? Would you say that most people have responsive desire? Or because because, okay, so let's talk about that. The other type of desire, which a lot of people have, which is misunderstood, people don't even know this about themselves, is that they might have responsive desire. So can you talk about that?
Yes. So going back to Emily Nagoski, the author of the book Come As You Are, fabulous book for those who haven't read it yet. She talks about responsive desire is desire that emerges in response to pleasure. So the pleasure is maybe already happening. The arousal is already on board. The desire kind of comes along the way. So it means that, day to day, you might not have a sexual thought. It may never occur to you. But maybe, let's say your partner comes over, it's a relatively good time, you're not in the middle of something, they start maybe, touching or caressing, or you're lying in bed together and you're talking, and suddenly something feels good. You have a little skin-to-skin contact, and it's like, oh, this is kind of nice, and maybe I am a bit motivated to seek out more. Yes. So that's responsive desire. And there's different data on this. I think it's about 50-50 in the general population, because there's some suggestion that, for women, responsive desire is like 75% of women, 25% of men, that spontaneous is more, say 75%. But there are some newer studies that suggest that across gender, any partner is sort of equally likely to be the higher or lower libido partner, that it really isn't gender dependent. Right. And so I'm inclined to sort of extrapolate from that and say it's about half and half.
Yes.
Or so it seems.
But there's a difference between desire and libido.
There are some people.
Are they the same?
Differently. I use them interchangeably.
Okay, so they are the same. Okay. Yeah. So the one thing that I was really interested to read was that, when people are coming to see you as a sex therapist, they're coming in, and a lot of them are saying, like, I feel like there's something wrong with me. I'm broken. Right?
Yeah.
And they want to change themselves so that they want that to have spontaneous desire, because they think my partner is able to just get turned on and like want sex right away and can do it and be like, I'm into this. Whereas I'm not that way. And right. And that's what you're doing. You're helping them understand their bodies and how they function, which is like, and they probably are responsive if that's the way their bodies are.
More often than not, that's the case. And, what's the common scenario is the lower libido partner reaching out, seeking out services for sex therapy or support, seeing themselves as the problem, and maybe even having their partner view it as such as well, that the lower libido partner is the problem. And the goal is often, whether it's, conscious or subconscious, the goal is often when they seek out services to make the lower libido partner's desire match the higher libido partner. And we use the higher libido partner then as a barometer for what's like good, or what's sufficient, or what's satisfying. And that really does a disservice to both.
Yes.
Because what it's saying is one person has the right amount of desire.
Right.
One person has the wrong amount of desire. When there's really there's no set point for how much desire you should have. The amount of desire, the amount of sex that you should be having is the one that's right for everybody involved.
Absolutely. So there's four things. So if there's 50%, let's just say 50% of the population that has responsive desire, that's something that's very important for us to recognize because, right? I mean, and would you say that if like most people, when they're entering into a new relationship, you naturally would have more spontaneous desire? Would that be true?
It's
even though like over time you might be more responsive.
Yes,
that's actually something, right? And that's actually something to recognize, because If your desire changes after you've been together for a year, 2 years, and now you're like thinking, oh, I've got a low libido,
Right.
maybe that's not it.
Right.
Maybe it's that you need the all the ingredients for getting your body ready for that desire.
Yeah. Yeah. What happens a lot is for people who have more of a responsive desire style, they will take on more of a spontaneous style, or it'll look more spontaneous at the beginning of a relationship.
Yes, that's what I was trying to say.
So you've got like maybe two or more people who are more spontaneous, and it looks that way, and it sort of adds up well. And then the person whose maybe style is more predominantly responsive, after the honeymoon period, the first 6 months to 2 years, it goes back to responsive, which is maybe where its set point is. And when we're not taught to expect that, and when we look at spontaneous as the measure of what's normal or okay, then the responsive desire is unsettling when that eventually happens, because you're not anticipating it and it catches you off guard. But then B, the narrative that like something's wrong because you changed and it's not the way it used to be. It's very then easy to look to that person and say something's off with you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how are you helping clients with ways to get into a place where they are? And there's a lot in the book. It's not just like, I know it's just not one answer. But if you could help them recognize, okay, it sounds to me like you've got spontaneous desire as your predominant desire. And it sounds to me like yours is responsive. How do you work with them to come to this place where you can work together? It's understanding, right?
Yeah. Yeah. The first part is putting names to that and normalizing that these are two equally valid ways to experience desire, that one is not better than or worse than the other. And sometimes even just that information alone can help people feel more settled in their dynamic, because there are so many times in which this more spontaneous leaning partner might take it personally that the person who's more responsive is not demonstrating a more spontaneous style. And it can sort of touch on tender parts of us with a narrative that says, you don't find me attractive anymore, you're not as interested in me, you don't want me. When they hear that there's a different style of desire and that it just has a different operating system, that can really help to quiet and ease back some of those, the narrative, that the insecure feelings that come up along the way with, wait a minute, what happened?
Yes. So in the book, you talk about something that it's called a sexual staircase. And you say, well, first of all, can you just talk to us about it? What is a sexual staircase, and how you're helping coach people and couples around just like, we have to get off the sexual staircase. and it's an ingrained belief on how we are supposed to operate, right? In the bedroom when it comes to sex. So tell me, tell us about that.
Yeah. It's the concept of the staircase is just giving a visual image to what most sex therapists talk about as a typical sexual script. Yeah. And a typical sexual script, again, having some Hollywood influence, or having, sort of a dominant cultural narrative that sex, when I say the word sex, or like go have sex, or we had sex, you have an image in your mind of what that means, that it started here, that it progressed to there, and that it culminated in this. And the typical sort of landscape for that is something around like kissing, and then some touching, and then there's usually genitals introduced, and then maybe or maybe not oral sex. It tends to center penetration, and the end goal and the end point is orgasm. And that's a standard typical sexual script. And it's got a hierarchy, and it's got a very set sort of linear progression. And most people, when I show them this image of a staircase with those, elements on the step, they go, oh yeah, that's sex. That's familiar, right?
Yes.
The challenge with the staircase is it tends to be, pretty fixed in terms of like this goes before this and this goes before that. It's got a hierarchical element to it that says that this counts as real sex and this counts as, foreplay, or doesn't count as sex. And it shows preference to orgasms and penetration. So for folks, and there are many folks, where that's not the be all end all for them, or that's not their most pleasurable thing to do with a partner, it's basically got this sort of sense that that's, deficient, or there's something defective about that. Like you should be placing these things at the top of the staircase. And that's really what sex is for and all about.
Right.
There are many people for whom the staircase works well. And that's okay. And that's just fine. But the more rigidly we adhere to one script for sex, the less sex we're likely to have over time.
Yeah. Wow. So, and that your book, you talk a lot about just you're helping people to, because I think, there's this whole section about understanding what gives you pleasure. And we may not even have really thought a lot about, and so there's body mapping, under getting to know your body and understanding your pleasure points, what makes, and pleasure, not just sexual, like
right.
The importance of pleasure and what that looks like for you, and understanding that in your partner.
Right.
And this makes me think of a story that you tell around around one couple, sorry. And I think it was Rivka and Chaim. I think there's Chaim. Sorry, thank you. Good.
Okay.
I was trying. I did not know how to pronounce that name. Perfect.
That's okay. It's a Hebrew word.
Yes, beautiful.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful pronunciation.
Yeah.
And I don't know if this is a woman and a man, but
Yeah.
Rivka wants to have sex once a week and penetrative sex, and Chaim wants once a month, and he wants, his predominant pleasure of desire is oral sex. And it's like, so he was bending to her and wanting, okay, so you want it once a week and you want to have penetrative sex, so that's what we're doing. But they're coming to your office and his desire is not being met in the way that, so that speaks to, first of all, like the frequency, and the sexual staircase on like actually what, and over time, you could see how in a couple dynamic, this can happen in so many ways with many couples. It's like, if you bend to do what your partner wants all the time and you're not getting what you want, it's just not at the satisfaction that you're both looking for
anymore.
No. Right.
Yeah. We talk about, like, just take it out of sex for a minute. We talk about like movies. If every time you go to sit down for movie night, your partner's like, my choice. And my choice is, maybe sometimes it's good for you, but maybe sometimes it's stuff that you would just not prefer. Or even sometimes, something that you would really not choose to engage in at all. And if every time it was like, movie night means you choose the movie, I never get to choose the movie, I don't get to experience what it's like to choose the movie and do, watch something that really is enjoyable for me, how long before you opt out of movie night?
Right. Oh my gosh, I really like that. I like the comparison. Yeah. Because it makes sense.
It makes sense then that the person who's like, I don't like movies, and then we start to dig into it.
I just don't like movies because, and then it turns into this whole thing. I don't like movies. I don't like sex. I don't want sex.
Do you not like movies, or do you not like or prefer certain genres? Or maybe, sitting down and watching a 2-hour movie from start to finish is too much. Maybe we watch it in phases. Maybe not everything doesn't have to be this sort of all or none. So when we start to tease out and dig into, like, do you really not like movies? And some people will say, and we'll tease it out and they'll say, I'm not into movies. And that's fine.
Yes.
More often than not, it's I don't like the way that I have experienced movies.
Right. So in you have there's prompts in here to look at what is it like, what are your sexual desires? What are your fantasies? What is it that gives you the greatest pleasure? And there is an invitation, obviously, to share this if you're with a partner, with somebody, with your partner. And you have this concept called don't yuck someone's yum.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
can you talk to us about that?
Yeah. I wish we could take ownership for that language.
I like it.
None of us know. I don't know if anyone knows where it originates, but it's a saying in the sexual health community that we don't yuck
Yeah.
someone's yum. And what that means is that we really want to create a safe space for people to say what they like without demeaning that and without judging that. Because somebody could like something, let's say your partner shares a fantasy or something that they would be interested in doing. We can hold space for two things. One, I'm not willing or interested in doing that with you, but I can accept and hear about that interest. I can just know that that's something that would be interesting to you. And I can validate that and just say, I hear you. It sounds like that would be really appealing to you, and I get it. So,
Yeah.
we want to be really tender about that, because something that can happen unintentionally is if we have a sort of ick reaction when a partner is sharing something vulnerable, particularly around a sexual interest or preference or fantasy. Sometimes the experience of feeling judged around that can generalize out. And so I've seen just one or two comments made between partners years and decades ago that have lasted for years and decades because the sting of that was so strong in the moment, the feeling of, shame or judgment. And sometimes people have a hard time getting over it. And so we just want to be mindful of how we talk about these things, because sharing a desire, a fantasy, an interest, it's vulnerable and it's tender.
Absolutely. And there's such a great section in your book that goes through different individual ways that we are affected, our sexual lives are affected. You talk about stress, you talk about shame, trauma. And can we just go through a few things like this, Lauren? Like, for instance, how stress has a huge impact on your desire.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And why is that?
Stress can have, an effect on people differently. It's really interesting, actually, because there was a time I might have believed early on in my career that stress impacted people negatively in terms of their sexual desire or sexual, makeup. And over the years and with a better understanding of our nervous systems and the differences between us and how things work, there's so much individual variation. And it's interesting that stress for some people completely depletes any interest in sex. It's the last thing on their mind, and they're unwilling to engage. And that's fair. That some people are just like, I can't get in this headspace. I can't think about it. It really hits the brakes for me. And so, we really need to honor that. For some folks, there's just certain times where it's a non-starter. And part of that can be because their mind is really distracted thinking about a zillion other things. And so it's really hard to be present for intimate connection or to even really receive the pleasure in the moment if your mind is, everywhere else. For some people, it's their body is going into a stress response. And so they feel more like shut down and numb and just not as open to, sexual contact and needing to be sort of protective. And maybe it's seeking more solitude or alone time to sort of recalibrate and regulate. There are other folks for whom stress revs on the gas pedal towards sex, that they're so much more interested in seeking out sex. And for those people, it's often because sex can be regulating in and of itself, that they can go
It's like a
from,
release.
it's a release. It can, you can feel
Yeah.
numb. And then with sex and physical contact, it can help sort of animate your system, get you back into, a baseline that you can work with. And so it's really just individual difference. And it's hard to sort of know, is there a particular rhyme or reason why for one person it's motivating and for one person it's the opposite? I don't know that we have an answer to that.
Right.
But it's important to know which one might be more true for you.
Yes. So there is a big piece about shame, and how, like you just talked about right there, like shame can obviously affect your sex life so much. Like, for instance, if you're sharing with your partner and you feel so shamed by sharing your fantasy, and you can carry that for years, right? Yeah. And you do share a story about a client who you had worked with, who, when she was growing up, she was told, and within her culture, or I think it was her mom or grandma, I can't remember, said to her, sex is not pleasurable. Like, as a woman, that's not why we have sex. Right. It's for, and this body is just for procreation. Your body's just for procreation. You're not supposed to have sex. That's not what women are like. It's like against yourself, your body, right? Yeah. And so she didn't really understand that until she was with a partner and kept turning away from him when he was wanting to enjoy sex. And that was a great learning for her. But like, wow, I could see that, how if you grew up thinking those things,
the imprint of some of those early messages can just, stay with us for such a long time. And unfortunately, sometimes, especially our younger formative years, those messages can be, they can run so deep that it can take sometimes a real sort of intentional process to unlearn something that's no longer serving us or even harming us. And so unpacking sexual shame is often a process that takes some time, and that takes connection, community. It's hard to chip away at sexual shame by yourself. It helps to have, a partner or a therapist or podcasts to listen to that just you hear other humans talking about it in a really different way than how it was maybe introduced to you at a younger age.
Right. So when you do encounter that, or even just people, like, I'd be interested to learn, are you having you must be having discussions, because you talk about it in the book, about pleasure. So in your office, are you actually talking to people about just understanding that, do people have shame around pleasure? That's one question I have, because I think, like, I'm not one of those people, but I do think that it's like this thing in our society that is underrated.
Yeah.
It's okay to want, and not, go ahead, talk about pleasure. Please, let's talk about the importance of pleasure.
It's seen as unproductive by some people. It's seen as something you have to earn. It's seen as something that is inappropriate for some people, depending on the culture you grew up in. There's also other systems at play that diminish our sense of pleasure, our relationship to pleasure. So you've got things like sexual shame around sexual pleasure specifically. You've got diet culture that says don't eat too much of this or that. Right. Which usually the things they're saying don't eat too much taste really good and are pleasurable.
Yes.
You've got a hustle culture that says work hard, play hard, but the emphasis is more, at least, in the world, we see more of the work hard side and not as much of the play hard side.
And not as much as the fun. Yeah.
Right. So people can struggle with just general concept of pleasure because I don't think we get a lot of permission culturally, societally, to just, find that, enjoy that, savor that, explore that.
Yeah. So they're in the book on page. I've got this book is full of dog ears. So I wanted to just talk about the ways that you're helping people navigate their differences in desire and getting the spark back. And right, one of the things that I really liked your concept around intimacy dates, rather than a lot of us have heard of scheduling sex and how I believe that, prioritizing your sex life is very important in a relationship. Yeah. So booking it in your calendar, I think it's a great idea, but you take it further into something called intimacy dates. Yeah. I thought this was great. So can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. You hear this concept. I mean, people don't love, or I'll say many people, I get a lot of pushback around scheduling sex.
I'm sure.
Because the set point is spontaneity, right? Spontaneous sex shouldn't have to be planned. But
that actually goes back to what we were just talking about, right? Like that is unlearning that.
That's right.
Because if your partner's more responsive, you actually probably do have to plan it. Yeah.
Because what happens is if the most common dynamic is that one partner leans more spontaneous and one partner leans more responsive, and they get together. As do most partnerships that have some of these differences that kind of balance each other out in some ways. So for the spontaneous desire, style, why would you need to plan that? I don't need to plan it. It's just, it occurs to me and then I seek you out and we do that. But for folks who have more predominant responsive styles, that doesn't always work. And that might lead to a really challenging dynamic where the person who has more spontaneous desire is trying to initiate sex. And the more responsive person is saying no, because it's not a great time, because there's a lot of things that are hitting their brakes that are, just making it hard for them to be, present and available. So, when you plan something, not only does that help, speak to someone with more responsive desire, but it also helps to kind of move some things around. Like, let's say you have a lot of things on your mind, a to-do list, you have certain preferences for your environment. We can actually do a little bit of navigating and pre-planning so that we can set things up. So, maybe we take a couple things off the to-do list, or maybe we set up a less cluttered environment, or you take a shower, not too long before, whatever it is that you need to feel more present and ready. But, most people have heard about sex dates, and what they mean by that is let's make time and hop on the staircase. Like, let's go through steps. And for some people, that works great. And I don't want to knock that. If that works for you, that's great. I never see those people.
They're not in my office.
They're not in my office because that's working for them. And kudos, that's great. But there's a lot of reasons why that doesn't work. And part of what doesn't work is that for the person who may not have their sort of own motivator for sex, where maybe they're doing that more to pleasure a partner, what can happen for that person, who tends to be often a more responsive desire type of style, is they start having negative anticipation of the date. They start feeling pressure about that. And the other person, the more spontaneous style, is like, yay, we get to have sex. It's exciting. There's anticipation that's positive. But for the other partner, it's maybe more negative anticipation. There's this buildup of pressure, anxiety, stress, that I have to show up on this day and this time and have my game face on.
Right.
And that ends up shutting things down. It doesn't work.
So, no. And so I liked your ideas. So the intimacy date, it's your opportunity to come together and share intimacy. And intimacy is such a big, it's an all-encompassing. It's not just sex, right? Yeah. So, you've got, I love the date menu, intimacy date menu. So there's just 2 pages of ideas around here. I'll just say a few. So just kissing, making out, right?
Yeah.
Full body massage. Why not? foot massage, back massage, spooning, cuddling. Obviously, you could have sex in many of its forms.
Yeah.
Watching an erotic or romantic video together. There's a lot of different ideas here. And it's about coming together and sharing an intimate moments, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And, when you can see it as, all of these different options, that tends to help, because I liken it to, you make a reservation at a restaurant and you show up, but you don't pre-order your meal yet because you don't know how you're going to feel when you sit down at the table at that specific
Take a look at the menu. What would you like to do today, sweetheart?
Yeah. Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
I like that.
Because essentially what you're saying to people, when you say schedule sex, at least for some people, is you're going to have, and I don't mean it to say that, sex is a 3-course meal specifically and these other things are just appetizers. But if you go with the metaphor for a moment, that it's like saying, you're going to sit down and have this very specific thing. And imagine if you ordered the same meal every time and it was the same way, no matter how hungry you are, no matter what kind of day you had, no matter, what the weather is like, no matter the climate of the relationship. And you might be I am somebody who literally, like, I could eat the same thing all the time and be just very fine with that. But you might be partnered with somebody who says, but I'm not, I need to be able to kind of gauge how I feel, how hungry I am, what I feel like. And maybe most of the time I order the same thing, but once in a while it's nice to, take a peek around and see what the daily special is, just kind of do something a little different. So even if, the staircase works for you or works for one of you the majority of the time, you're going to be more likely to have a ritual around intimacy if you broaden and expand what's available. Because think about it this way. Let's say you sit down at the restaurant and one partner says, I'm not hungry at all. Does that mean that we just leave and the person who's sitting
because
down,
the other person is like, I'm hungry.
Right.
And I want to spend this time with you.
That's right. What it doesn't mean, though, is I have to shove food down my face and force feed myself food.
Right.
What it does maybe look like is maybe I'll just have a little nibble on an appetizer. Maybe I'm just going to sip on some water and keep you company. Maybe, I'm not hungry when I get here, but then as I sit here for a while, then I get hungry.
Yes.
So it's saying there's all these possibilities. And so it's getting creative. One person wants more of a sexual experience. The other person is maybe not there. There are multiple options for how to navigate that.
Yes.
And it goes really beyond just that staircase.
Really like that. You also have something which I thought was so valuable. If you are in a partnership, called State of the Union. Mm-hmm. And this is, sexual state of the union. So this is when you are having regular conversations, meetings to talk about your sex life.
Yeah.
It wasn't until I met my husband that I started really talking about sex with a partner, like just what we both liked and and he's like educating me because I'm like, oh, I didn't know that. And we're like going to sex shows and I'm like, whoa, I've never seen that before. It's just like, it felt like a kid in a candy store. What the heck is going on here? But it was very educational. And I just really appreciated the fact that he was so open and then I felt like, oh, I could talk about this. So I just think talking about it is so important. And I think many of us that's how we started our conversation, right, Lauren, was just saying how people aren't talking about it.
Right. And you've got sort of this duality because there's a lot of sexuality that can be embedded in our media. And at the same time, we're not talking about it openly. We're not experiencing, very comprehensive sex education. So you've got this sort of both and, that there's not a lot of open dialogue about what to expect and what's realistic. And you just get the Hollywood version. I can't remember who it is. I think it's Dr. Lori Mintz or Dr. Lori Brotto, that one of my colleagues that I can attribute this to, but it's like learning to drive by watching Fast and the Furious movies.
Yeah. Is that, yeah.
Like,
right?
in a non-sexual sphere, that doesn't make any sense.
Right.
But sometimes in a sexual sphere, because we don't see maybe, depictions outside of, the media, because maybe we're not having some of those conversations at home, that becomes the sort of standard with which we're trying to meet. And it's just not realistic.
Yeah. Well, I hope that, my hope is that so many people listen to this episode and they read your book and learn more so that we can have a more pleasurable sex life. I mean, I think we all want that. And I think you're really helping people with that. So thank you for all the work that you're doing. And then
thank you so much. I really appreciate
I'm going to close I'm going to close it with a blessing with your words. May we be more flexible, adaptable, open-minded, playful, and curious when it comes to ours and our partner's sexual selves. And may we honor our innate desire and prioritize pleasure in our lives. So, thank you, Dr. Lauren. Please visit realloveready.com to become a member of our community. Submit your relationship questions for our podcast experts at reallovereadypodcast@gmail.com. We read everything you send. Be sure to rate and review this podcast. Your feedback helps us get you the relationship advice and guidance you need. The Real Love Ready podcast is recorded and edited by Maya Anstey. Transcriptions by Otter.ai and edited by Maya Anstey. We at Real Love Ready acknowledge and express gratitude for the Coast Salish people, the stewards of the land on which we work and play, and encourage everyone listening to take a moment to acknowledge and express gratitude for those that have stewarded and continue to steward the land that you live on as well.